Hey, welcome back to Lunch Hour Live. I'm Sue O'Connell. Gosh, when Notre Dame Cathedral caught fire in 2019, Paris came very close to losing more than 800 years of history. And as engineers rebuild, researchers are using some cutting-edge technology to piece together what happened. And Nova is here to explain the science behind what it will take to restore this architectural masterpiece. Here's a look at Nova's latest documentary, Saving Notre Dame.
Notre Dame de Paris, a treasured icon of Gothic architecture and medieval engineering. Built from glass, stone, and timber over the course of 2 centuries, for 850 years, this 226-foot-tall cathedral has been an enduring symbol at the heart of French culture and more.
Notre Dame is one of humanity's greatest artistic and architectural achievements.
Notre Dame is not just Paris, it's France. And beyond France, it's the world.
But on April 15th, 2019, a disaster that threatens to destroy it all strikes. A massive fire, raging out of control. Oh my God. Leaves the cathedral in ruins. Now, an elite team of engineers, scientists, and master craftspeople battle to save this fragile structure from a catastrophic collapse.
Scaffolding. On doit sortir.
Out of tragedy, an opportunity is born.
Oh, this is a dating fossil.
To solve archaeological mysteries and understand the very fabric of this medieval megastructure like never before.
We can identify each chemical element.
Can clues from the past help save and rebuild this landmark? And can pioneering technology prevent another disaster?
What we are producing today will be the information usable for the next generations.
All so fascinating, and we're going to give you a behind-the-scenes look into the making of the film. I'm joined by Joby Lubman. He's the director and producer of Saving Notre Dame. Joby, welcome to Lunch Hour Live.
Hello, Sue. How are you doing?
Welcome
to Lockdown London.
From lockdown. We're not locked down Boston yet, but we almost are. And I want to welcome our viewers on social media. If you have questions or comments, please just leave them in the comment section and we'll get to them. Joby, this is such an amazing film, such a heartbreaking story, an inspiring story. You've been directing major engineering and architecture documentaries now for like almost a decade. How did you approach telling this story of one of the world's most iconic buildings and such an amazing story of how it was built, what happened, and what they're doing now? How do you approach that?
Well, we were interested in, we decided to go using the approach of the materials. So the 3 kind of main elements of Notre Dame, the stone, the timber, and the glass, we decided to use those as our entry point. What do those materials, how were those materials affected by the fire? What remains of those materials, and what can those materials do to help scientists eventually rebuild, architects eventually rebuild Notre Dame?
Well, one of the things that when I saw the building, this iconic structure on fire, I had not had the opportunity to visit it. But I remember one of the commentators talking about how within Notre Dame was a forest, right? Instead of thinking of it as a building, if you thought about it as a forest covered by stone, it really would help you understand what happened and why the fire happened. And I'm wondering, when we think about it through the lens of Nova, often Nova is about science, like about space or climate change and biology, the human body. We don't often talk about architecture as science. Do you view reconstructing Notre Dame, does that fall into the science category for you?
Oh my word! Yeah, for sure. It's kind of the perfect mixture of science and history in a building. The masons, the people that built Notre Dame, they were in many respects scientists. They were using the materials the best they knew how, using the mechanical properties of the materials. They were engineers before engineering. They were scientists before science, really. So, yeah, it's kind of a very interesting way to look at the history of science, the history of architecture through these remarkable buildings.
We want to take a look at another clip as we're talking about architecture. One of the major structures that survived the fire were Notre Dame's flying buttresses, but they just barely made it. And engineers were trying to prevent the walls of the cathedral from collapsing. It became clear that piecing Notre Dame back together again is a logistical and safety nightmare. Let's take a look at one of the clips.
To avert a catastrophic collapse, engineers could build a steel skeleton inside the nave to brace the walls. Then, even if the vaulting caves in, the walls of Notre Dame would stay standing. But it's far too dangerous for workers to erect steelwork beneath the compromised structure.
We can't go under the vaults because we don't know whether they'll fall or not.
So instead of bracing the walls from the inside, the team will build timber frames under the buttresses outside. Now, if the vaulting does fall in, the buttresses can't push on the walls, and they won't come tumbling down.
C'est la liste des pièces à tailler pour le chantier. N'oublie pas d'essayer de tailler en premier ce qu'ils doivent assembler à côté.
They're very difficult because no flying buttress is identical to another. They are made to measure.
Workers at this factory race to cut and assemble around 250 tons of timber to create the massive supports Philippe's team needs to prop up the vaults. It's critical each support fits perfectly beneath each flying buttress to hold its weight. Working around and inside this space is a logistical nightmare. 210 tons of lead cladding covered the cathedral roof. This was mostly melted during the fire, and now toxic lead dust covers every surface. The worksite is highly contaminated. Until the site is clean, team members must wear full protective clothing to pass into the contaminated zone. When leaving site, they undress, discard all clothing, carefully wash equipment, then shower themselves. Only then can they go back to the clean area, even for a lunch break.
It's very difficult to endure for the workers who've had to deal with these procedures for months. These regulations are not normal, but this whole site is not normal.
But finally, 5 months later, all 28 flying buttresses are locked in place, and the walls are safe.
So, Joby, it doesn't seem quite as weird now watching people suit up to do work, unfortunately, due to COVID-19. But having said that, this was a very dangerous site to be on. And I'm wondering, what were some of the safety challenges that you and the crew and the filmmakers had to take and be aware of while you were filming this documentary?
Yeah, so I mean, just getting equipment onto and off site, obviously you can't put cameras, sound equipment through the shower. So of course we had to consider that. We're absolutely minimal crew, minimal equipment, and we were on and off site as quickly as we could possibly do safely. So it was, bringing camera equipment on and off site we would do it at the start of the day. Everything would stay on site. We would stay on site all day, and then we would wipe down the equipment very carefully with special wipes, then discard all our clothing, shower, and take everything through completely clean and naked. So it was a very a bit of a strange ritual, and with minimal amount of time on site, we had to make every second count. And kind of getting into the site is almost a military kind of institution. There's footbaths and scanners and locks to go everywhere. You had to have permission to go everywhere. We had to be chaperoned at all times, of course. Day one, we went on site and we were filming. Very first stuff we were filming, alarm went off and we had to leave site immediately after maybe 30 minutes filming inside Notre Dame. The sensors on the scaffolding had been triggered. The scaffolding had moved and we were rushed off site. Everything was fine. Nothing collapsed, but it meant that our filming was constantly challenged. It was constantly challenging. We couldn't quite we could never be sure we would be able to film, even when we had negotiated the access, when we had decided we are going to film this with these people. Nothing was certain going onto that website.
Basically, you're on a crisis. You're in a crisis zone and a museum and a restoration project and a clean house, sort of at the same time, which I can't even imagine the challenges around that. One of the challenges, too, I hadn't even thought of until I watched the documentary, is that the reconstruction of Notre Dame, they're using the same kind of wood and stone instead of modern materials and modern metals. And I'm not doing a very good job explaining how much the same the wood and the stone needs to be. Can you talk a little bit about those choices, and also why not just take the easy route? Why not just use some modern materials and get it done?
Yeah, so we mentioned a moment ago. The people that built this structure, they knew what they were doing. This is ancient knowledge passed down. They know the mechanical properties of the timber. They know the mechanical properties and the differences in the limestone that they were using for the different parts of the structure. They were so familiar with these materials. They knew exactly how it would behave in a particular part of the structure. So they knew exactly what kind of stone or what grain of timber to use for that part of the structure. So that's the reason why they need to find the same materials with the same mechanical properties to rebuild the structure in the same way. If they use the wrong density of limestone for a pillar, let's say, they might find that pillar only lasts a few decades, and all of a sudden they've got to rebuild the whole thing again. If they put modern timbers up there that aren't carefully cut with the right grain in the right way to support the right loads, then they'll find that timber will degrade and won't be able to take the load. It won't last 850 years.
And it's important to note, too, and this is something I learned watching the documentary. I mean, I think I knew it, but I didn't really understand it. The generations it took to build. So it's not just like somebody laid out architectural blueprints and then everybody went to work to build Notre Dame. It was generations of workmen and science and experience and trial and error that brought us this iconic building.
Yeah, we're not used to that these days, are we? We expect if we design a skyscraper, then we'll see it built in the next 5 years. But back then, these weren't a project for them. These were a project for generations. They were buildings for God. They weren't for them. They weren't for the mortal. They were for the generations beyond. So they never looked at it like that. And there's few buildings being built today that are similar. Maybe Sagrada Familia. Gaudi never thought he would see it built in his lifetime, and of course he didn't. And there were several generations after that didn't see the cathedral, the Basilica of Sagrada Familia constructed. It's only just about to be done now. So these projects are generation upon generation, and it's a very different way of working to our kind of architectural instant gratification that we're so used to today.
I'll remind people watching on social media, if you have a question for Joby or about the project, please put them in comments and we'll bring them to Joby. And as I think you can see, there's nothing really easy about rebuilding Notre Dame, even when it comes to cleaning the windows. We're going to look at a clip to see just how much work it takes to remove the lead powder from Notre Dame's famous stained glass windows. And let me tell you, they're not using Windex. Let's take a look.
Glass scientist Claudine Loisel uses a handheld digital microscope to investigate the levels of lead powder on the stained glass. She must then formulate a strategy to clean every single panel, a vast decontamination program. This window is in the back of the cathedral, in the lower level, furthest from the inferno, but it's still badly contaminated.
Regarde la quantité de suie.
Fortunately, these windows have not been cleaned for 100 years, so the lead has settled on top of a dust layer, not on the glass itself.
The first thick layer of deposit was, we can say, as a small protection in one way. So we have just to remove all the deposit to clean these windows from the 19th century.
Claudine examines deposits from windows around the cathedral. The samples reveal vital clues about the spread of the lead contamination.
After the spire fell, the cloud of dust, lead, and different particles pushed in the other direction. So we are a little bit more protected in this area.
The windows of the upper level, in the path of the lead cloud, have been most contaminated. The team takes out and transports these panels to this special laboratory, where they experiment with ways to remove the lead. First, Claudine uses a precision vacuum cleaner to remove the 100 years of dust and most of the lead powder along with it.
So this is a good way to protect the conservator. You can control the action, the pressure on the glass and also on the painting.
Then she uses water and cotton balls to remove the last of the lead.
Of course, you need scientific evidence that it's working.
Claudine uses X-ray spectroscopy to determine exactly how many wipes it takes to bring the lead down to normal levels.
So we can identify each chemical element we have in the material.
Too few wipes, and the lead will remain. Too many wipes, and restoration will take longer than necessary.
Okay, now this analysis is finished.
After 5 wipes, Claudine checks to see if the glass is decontaminated.
Okay, we have different chemical elements, calcium, iron, and if we want to see the lead, there is no lead. After 9 months, we can see a good solution, a good way to clean and to preserve the stained glass windows from Notre Dame.
Eureka! Finally, we have a question,
Easy.
Joe, easy peasy, from Mark on Facebook, who wants to know why there are so many steps to be completed, steps to be completely clean for windows and for people going into Notre Dame. Why is it so important to have it be a clean zone and not bring materials and stuff and dirt from just outside of Notre Dame into the zone where they're working?
So, well, it's actually more about the contamination you will bring out with you. So it's on site. The whole place is covered with large amounts of lead. This vast quantity of lead flashing on that was made up the roof. 210 tons of lead was simply evaporated and spread out across Paris, the surrounding of Notre Dame, and of course much of it fell into the cathedral and onto the site. So just walking around site, touching anything, you are going to be getting a lot of lead. So it's critical that that you're washed carefully, that nothing comes out to potentially contaminate you or other people with large doses of lead, which obviously is toxic.
I learned a lot watching this documentary. I'm wondering, is there anything that was surprising to you that you either learned or discovered while you were filming?
Sure. A little bit ago, you saw those supports being put into place underneath the flying buttresses. Remarkably, that's actually the way that they were constructed in the first place. They would build exactly those kind of frames and place the stones on top of that frame to form the buttress. So they would use that precise technique, those big timber frames, to actually build up the buttresses originally. So essentially, that they are just bringing back those supports to add that stability to prevent those buttresses pushing the walls in much the same way they did when they built it.
One of the amazing things to me about older buildings, and here in Boston, we certainly don't have buildings quite that old, but occasionally I'll talk with somebody who works in an old church, maybe even a church from the 1700s, and they'll remove like part of it to do some repair or restoration or improvement, and they'll find out that something actually wasn't being held up by anything, right? Like there was no support beam there. And I'm just wondering, did the generational building of Notre Dame sort of, and the trial and error sort of make it as stable as one would expect it to be if it were being built today?
Well, I mean, I think something we have to remember is that Notre Dame is many layers of construction. So, for instance, the flying buttresses, they were smaller. We think originally, and they were augmented. They were built up to be stronger later on because the masons were worried. Oh my God, there's too much weight. This is at risk of falling down. So layer upon layer, trial and error, they would improve, strengthen over hundreds of years. As new techniques were developed, they would be added to it. So that's it. It's the product of lots of learning, of generation upon generation of new methods and techniques. So it's there's I'm sure that there were lots of problems, that there may have even been collapses, but obviously the way it's stood for hundreds of years seems to have worked as a structure. The important thing with that cathedral is it all works together. You take away one of those elements, it's drastically weakened. So all of that structure is working together to distribute the loads, and it's critical that you'll see in the documentary, if one of those elements is taken away, the whole structure is destabilized.
Taking all of that into consideration and watching the documentary on how long it's taking, as it should take, it takes a long time to do things like discover what the right amount of solution and effort to take the right amount of lead off of the stained glass windows. When this terrible disaster happened, French President Emmanuel Macron said that he hoped that construction on Notre Dame would be completed in 5 years. What's the update on that, and what can we look forward to in the future to get to where they want to be?
Well, I'd say that they are making remarkable progress. They still haven't, considering the magnitude of work that needs to happen, but they're just about to finally remove the last layers of the burnt scaffolding, which is a huge project. And they're now working. Claudine, who you saw in that clip of the glass, that her and her team are now almost finished cleaning the lower level of windows. There's 3 levels of windows in Notre Dame, so they've almost got to that stage already. So that they've done remarkably. With COVID as well, they've managed to get a lot done. Still a huge amount to do. They've just taken core samples from the vaulting, the remaining vaulting that's still up there, to see exactly what damage the fire has done to the vaulting stone and the water, of course, that was soaked in from the firefighting. So that analysis will help them determine the level of damage, the areas of the vaulting that need to be completely replaced, and those that can stay up there. Then, I don't know what stage you're at now, but in terms of a plan for actually shoring up the vaulting that's still up there so they can get to it from underneath, because obviously that's extremely dangerous, working under those stones that are kind of hanging there precariously, with large sections of it missing.
Joby, where can folks find this program, this fabulous NOVA piece? Where can people watch it?
I understand it's to be broadcast PBS 9 p.m. The 25th of November.
Well, it's remarkable. Thank you for doing it and spending your passion, and thanks for joining us to talk about it and sharing your experience. It really is. I enjoyed watching it very much. Thanks, Joby.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody watching on Facebook and YouTube. I'm Sue O'Connell. We'll be off next week for Thanksgiving, but we'll be back in December. So keep an eye on us, and we'll be back with Lunch Hour Live soon. Thanks for watching.